Today, the story of Pretty Boy Floyd. Born in poverty, branded an outlaw, and buried a legend. Was he a cold blooded killer? Or the last working class hero America ever had? This is Deadly Truths, the legend of Pretty Boy Floyd. Pretty Boy Floyd entered the world on February 3rd, 1904, in a rough log cabin outside of Adairsville, Georgia. The second of 8 children born to Walter Lee Floyd and Mammy Floyd. The family was poor but proud, tenant farmers scraping by on thin soil and hard seasons. When Charles was about 7, the Floyds joined the Great Southern Migration westward, part of the wave of families chasing better fortunes in the Indian Territory that would soon become Oklahoma. They settled near Athens, a small farming community just east of Sallisaw. Life there meant long days, red dust, and hard labor, the kind that leaves a boy's hands blistered before he's old enough to shave. Neighbors remembered the Floyd children as barefoot and sunburned, working dawn to dusk in the cotton fields. Charles had a quick smile, but also fierce pride. He hated being looked down on, especially by the wealthy ranchers and bankers who profited from others' debt. Those early lessons in class divide, the haves and the have-nots, would leave their mark. He attended Atkins School, but only sporadically. Work always came first. Still, he was bright, sharp-witted, and unusually observant. People later said Floyd had eyes that didn't miss much. He grew into a striking young man, lean, dark-haired, and confident. Even before the nickname, he was already known for being pretty, though he hated the word. At 17, he married Ruby Hardgraves, a local girl from the next county over. They soon had a son, Jack Dempsey Floyd, named after the famous boxer. By all accounts, Floyd loved Ruby and the baby, but the 1920s were ruthless in Oklahoma, and especially to Oklahoma farm families. Oil money flooded the state, but only for a lucky few. For everyone else, debt was a noose. Floyd tried to live straight, working on farms, hauling grain, but wages were meager and bills never stopped coming. The divide between the rich and the poor gnawed at him. In small-town Oklahoma, a man's options were few: sweat, starve, or steal. Around 1922, when he was barely out of his teens, Floyd reportedly took part in his first theft, a roll of coins from a post office. He was caught and fined, but the experience taught him something important. Crime paid better than the plow. He began running with small-time bootleggers and car thieves, men who lived fast and died faster. By the time the Great Depression arrived in 1929, Charles Arthur Floyd was already an outlaw in the making, skilled with an engine, quick with a gun, and convinced that the world had cheated him first. His story wasn't just about greed or rebellion, it was about survival. And somewhere along the way, during a robbery gone sideways in Missouri, a witness described him to police as a pretty boy with a gun. The nickname stuck, though Floyd himself despised it. He preferred something else entirely: Chalk, short for Choctaw, the name given to him by friends back home. To them, he was not a monster or a myth. He was Chalk Floyd, a country boy trying to even the odds. By the early 1920s, Charles Arthur Floyd was drifting. He'd been working odd jobs in Oklahoma and in Missouri, chasing seasonal labor wherever he could find it. Ruby and their baby son, Jack Dempsey, stayed mostly with her family, while Floyd bounced from one job to another. And as I said, he was everything from a farmhand to an oil worker, sometimes even a truck driver. He wanted to provide, but the wages were meager and the debts were mounting. That's when the talk of easy money started. Bootlegging and bank jobs were becoming the new economy of the desperate. A young man with steady hands and nerves of steel could make more in one night than a month behind a plow. 1924, Floyd teamed up with a small group of drifters, including William B. Shannon and John Slim Reed, and planned a couple of payroll robberies in St. Louis, Missouri. Their target, a Kroger grocery store clerk carrying the company's cash deposits. The robbery did not go smoothly. A witness caught a good look of Floyd's face as they escaped. Within weeks, he was arrested in Arkansas and extradited back to Missouri. The newspapers called him handsome and polite, almost surprised that someone who looked so decent could commit armed robbery. He was only 20 years old when the judge sentenced him to 5 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. Jefferson City, as all of these prisons back then, and even some of the prisons now, was not rehabilitation. It was a factory for criminals. The prison was overcrowded, it was brutal and ruled by gangs and guards who believed pain built discipline. Floyd entered as a poor farm kid who made a stupid mistake. He left as a man who trusted no one and had learned the mechanics of organized crime. Inside, he met bank robbers, safecrackers, and Prohibition-era bootleggers. Men from Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. They taught him how to plan a job, how to move across state lines, how to keep his mouth shut. He learned criminal codes, underground contacts, and even rudimentary ballistics. He also learned humiliation. Inmates were forced to march, heads down, in total silence. Meals were meager, cells freezing in the winter. Floyd later told friends he vowed never to return, but also never again to be caught. It was during this time that the nickname Pretty Boy just began to follow him around. Counts differ, but the most accepted version is that a female witness at his trial, or a Kansas City madam, remarked on his good looks, calling him that pretty boy. And then there was also the other story that it was a comment that was given in the paper. Just like Babyface Nelson, Floyd hated his nickname. He saw it as an insult, something that made him sound weak or foolish. He preferred to be called Chalk, and that was his hometown nickname. But once the newspapers printed it, there was no going back. Pretty Boy Floyd had entered America's folklore. While he served his time, Ruby Hardgraves Floyd tried to keep their lives intact. She raised their son alone in Oklahoma and visited when she could. Though the trip to Jefferson City was long and expensive, letters between them suggested genuine affection. She called him Charlie, never Pretty Boy. But prison changes people. Floyd grew harder, angrier, and more determined to fight a system he saw as corrupt. When he finally was paroled in 1929 after serving 4 years, or just around 4 years, Ruby hoped he'd come home for good. For a brief time, he did, and again, he worked odd jobs in Atkins trying to rebuild their life. It did not last. The country was collapsing into the Great Depression, and jobs were vanishing by the day. For a man branded as an ex-convict, honest work was nearly impossible to find. Within months, Floyd was back in the company of bootleggers and small-town robbers. Ruby did eventually file for divorce, not out of hate, but resignation. She still spoke well of him years after, saying he was a good man and he was born in the wrong time. But she couldn't raise their son in the shadow of the law. When you think about 1929, Floyd had crossed the line from petty criminal to a professional outlaw. He knew how to case a bank, how to plan an escape route, and how to keep a public image clean enough to win sympathy. And as I discussed, the boy who entered Jefferson City, a naive farmhand, had emerged a legend in the making, armed with knowledge, armed with anger, and a growing belief that robbing banks wasn't just survival, but it was justice. Inside, Floyd learned the real rules of survival: don't talk, don't trust, and don't ever get caught again. And he was not alone. Across the Midwest, another generation of young men were learning the same lessons in different cages. We had John Dillinger, right? And he went in for robbing a grocery store and came out knowing how to rob banks. You had Babyface Nelson. He entered reform school as a teenager and came out with a lifelong hatred for authority. You can even throw Pansram, who went to Leavenworth and was executed, into this. I mean, Babyface was not as sick as Pansram, but he was definitely completely messed up after going into reform school. And then you have Alvin Karpis of the Barker Karpis gang. He called prison the best underworld school in America. These weren't isolated cases, they were symptoms of a system that created what it claimed to destroy. Floyd's sentence at Jefferson City was supposed to correct him. In Oklahoma and Missouri, the lines between hunger and crime were razor thin. A farmer steals a chicken, 5 years. A banker ruins 100 families with bad loans, a handshake, and a golf game. The hypocrisy burned inside Floyd, and I can't say that I blame him for it. He saw justice as something rich men could buy and poor men could never afford. Again, this still stands true today. So when he got out, he didn't come home looking for redemption. He came out looking for revenge. To the desperate, someone like Pretty Boy Floyd, he didn't feel like a villain. He was vengeance in human form. He robbed banks, not people. He destroyed mortgage records so families could keep their land. He gave farmers cash and told them to keep quiet. Newspapers printed stories calling him the Robin Hood of the Cookson Hills. Whether those stories were true did not matter. What mattered was that people believed them. But in Washington, D.C., a new kind of lawman was building his own legend: J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover's young Bureau of Investigation needed villains, and men like Floyd, Dillinger, and Nelson were perfect. They were photogenic, they were reckless and violent, exactly the kind of public enemies that could justify Hoover's growing budget and national power. So when Floyd robbed a bank, the Bureau didn't just report it, they broadcasted it. They branded him Pretty Boy, a national symbol of defiance. The irony? The very system that locked him up to fix him was the same system that made him famous enough to hunt him. You take a man, you break him, you humiliate him, and then you're shocked when he comes back swinging. You can't starve a man, beat him down, and then expect him to pray for bread. So when Pretty Boy stepped through the iron gates of the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1929, he was 25 years old, already marked for the life as ex-convict 9211. The Great Depression was only months away at this point, but the collapse had already started, especially in Oklahoma. Drought, foreclosures, and families loading wagons to search for work that did not exist. The state released him with a few dollars and a train ticket. There was no parole programs back then, no job placements, and definitely no hope. Employers kept blacklists of ex-cons. Farmers wouldn't hire them. Oil fields were laying men off by the thousand. As Floyd told a friend later, a man can't live honest when honesty doesn't pay for bread. By spring 1930, Floyd had drifted south with a few old prison contacts. George Birdwell, a laid-off oil worker from Norman, Oklahoma, and then there was John Slim Reed, a mechanic, and William B. Shannon, also a fellow ex-con. They started with small jobs, stick-ups at gas stations, grocery store payrolls, and local banks that served as lifelines for farming towns. One of the first confirmed hits was the Sallisaw State Bank near his hometown. The take was roughly $3,000. But what people remembered was not the money. It was the fire. When the smoke cleared, the bank's mortgage ledgers were gone. Some said Floyd torched them deliberately, laughing that no man should lose his farm to paper. Others claimed the fire was accidental, but the story spread like gospel across eastern Oklahoma. Pretty Boy burned the debts. To farmers who just watched their land sold at auction, he became a savior in a fedora. Floyd crisscrossed the Midwest and South, robbing small banks in Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, and Ohio. He preferred rural towns, single street banks, one getaway road, quick in and out. He studied the habits of bank managers, the timing of shipments, and always had a stolen Ford V8 idling out front. He rarely hurt anyone. He was calm. One teller recalled him tipping his hat and saying, "We're not after your money, miss. We're just after the banks." Another time, when a frightened farmer dropped his wallet, Floyd picked it up and pressed it back into the man's hand. "You earned that," he said. No shouting, no random gunfire like Babyface. He believed violence drew attention. Between jobs, Floyd disappeared into Cookson Hills, a dense patch of forest and ridges, the same region he'd grown up in. It was a natural forest, dozens of trails, caves, and loyal locals who hid him from lawmen. Families would leave food in hollow logs, bacon, cornbread, jars of coffee grounds. In return, Floyd left cash under the plates or sometimes nothing at all but a note that read, "Thank you kindly." To the people of the Cookson Hills, he was not an outlaw. He was one of them, the barefoot boy who picked cotton beside them and now made the bankers afraid. Asking questions, farmers just shrugged. "Don't know him, ain't seen him, wouldn't turn him in if I did." The Bureau called it a conspiracy of silence. The locals called it loyalty. By 1931, Floyd's name was everywhere. He robbed a bank in Cartersville, Missouri, then another in Columbus, Kansas, and yet another in Ohio, sometimes within days. The press couldn't keep up. Headlines shouted, "Pretty Boy Floyd strikes again," even when he had nothing to do with the crime. The myth had taken on a life of its own. Every burned mortgage or unsolved robbery became his work. It didn't matter that half of those tales were fiction. People needed to believe in him, that someone somewhere was fighting back. Floyd never built an empire like Capone. He didn't have accountants or gunmen on salary. He operated in fluid crews who joined for one or two jobs, split the money, and then scattered. He had a few safe farms across Oklahoma and Missouri, a handful of trusted go-betweens, and an intricate knowledge of back roads and creek beds that could lose a posse in minutes. His style was half planned, half instinct, somewhere between Robin Hood and guerrilla fighter. He struck fast, avoided big cities, and used local goodwill as camouflage. To Hoover's bureau, that looked like genius. To Floyd, it was just survival. So let's do a deep dive into the gentleman bandit. By 1932, his legend, it was unstoppable. Stories painted him as chivalrous, right? So offering bank tellers cigarettes during holdups, paying off mortgages before he torched them, leaving $20 for groceries when he hid in a family's barn. There's little hard proof of these acts, but the myth was more powerful than the man. Hoover knew this. John Dillinger was rising in the North. Bank robberies were doubling every year. Hoover needed victories. He began feeding newspapers lurid language. Machine Gun Kelly, public enemy number one, psychopathic murderer. Agents circulated wanted posters showing Floyd with cold eyes and a Thompson submachine gun, the perfect monster for a frightened nation. But the truth, it's so much simpler. Floyd was not hiding in Chicago or St. Paul, which was known for considerably more crime. He was sitting on a porch in Atkins smoking rolled up cigarettes, surrounded by families who'd go to prison before betraying him. To the Bureau, that loyalty was defiance. To Oklahomans, it was justice. By the end of 1933, Floyd had stolen between $50,000 and $100,000. Good amount of money for back then, but it's not enough to make him rich. It was enough to make him famous. He was not organized, like I said, like any Chicago outfits, and you can't compare him to Dillinger or Babyface. Small crews, short jobs, and a network of poor Americans who saw him as a flicker of hope. So in Washington, he's a criminal, but in Oklahoma at the time, he was proof that the poor could fight back. He didn't build an empire. He built a legend, and in a starving nation that was worth more than gold. After his release from prison, most of Floyd's early robberies were fast and relatively nonviolent. But by 1931, things changed. Banks were arming guards and sheriffs were forming posse squads that didn't hesitate to shoot. In September of 1931, in Oklahoma, during a failed bank robbery, a bank guard reportedly fired first. Floyd's partner returned fire, and when Floyd's partner did return fire, that did kill the guard. Some witnesses later claimed that Floyd also fired. Others insisted he was outside at the time. There was no solid evidence placed that the fatal shot was from his hands at all. In March of 1932 in Bowling Green, Missouri, a shootout during another robbery left one policeman dead. But again, Bureau's reports were contradicted by the locals. Floyd and his crew were blamed for every unsolved killing between Tulsa and Kansas City, but there was never actual proof. Even in his own circle, Floyd was known to avoid bloodshed. He told an associate, "You can rob a bank easy. Killing is what brings the law." Still, the line between defense and murder did blur fast in the 1930s Midwest, where every man carried a gun and justice traveled by posse wagon, which anytime you mention a posse wagon, that's a frightening idea, right? It's time to discuss the Kansas City Massacre, the mythic crime from June 17th, 1933. I am a Kansas City native, so the Kansas City Massacre is definitely something that you learn about if you live in KC. This is the single event that turned Pretty Boy Floyd into a quote-unquote cop killer. And it's also one of the most controversial shootings of the entire gangster era. If you've ever been to Kansas City, there is Union Station. It's a train station and it's gorgeous. I highly recommend you visit there if you do go to visit. So at Union Station in Kansas City, federal agents were escorting convicted bank robber Frank Nash to prison when gunmen ambushed them. When the smoke cleared, 4 lawmen and Frank Nash were dead. Within 24 hours, J. Edgar Hoover's bureau announced that Pretty Boy Floyd, Adam Ricchetti, and an unidentified third man, possibly Vernon Miller, were responsible. Newspapers printed it as fact. Floyd leads bloodbath at Union Station. However, here's what later evidence showed. Floyd and Ricchetti were in the region, driving from Ohio towards Oklahoma. Several eyewitnesses' descriptions did not match Floyd or Ricchetti at all. Ballistics tests decades later suggested different weapons than the ones Floyd was known to use. Surviving agents' accounts changed multiple times, possibly to justify the Bureau's mistakes. Even Floyd himself denied it to his dying breath. According to eyewitness accounts, he told a farmer sheltering him weeks before his death, "I never killed them men in Kansas City. That's a lie they hung on me." Historians today, many now believe it's actually more connected to the mob now than anything when you look at what history actually says about it. But by then, the damage was done. The Bureau had its narrative, and again, if you've been listening to the prior episodes, when it comes to Hoover and the Bureau's narrative, it can be extremely deceiving, and it just feels like he just made things up as he went. This was pinned on Pretty Boy, but Pretty Boy had nothing to do with it. From that day forward, Pretty Boy Floyd wasn't a folk hero. He was a murderer of lawmen. And as all of the others we've discussed, Dillinger, Babyface, Ma Barker, the dubious distinction of public enemy number one was now on Floyd, and it was a target, right? Floyd was hunted like a war criminal. That pressure led to desperate moves and violence he could not avoid. In Ohio, 1933, Floyd allegedly killed a federal agent or police officer during a running gunfight after a bank robbery near Toledo. It's possible the shots came from Riccati instead, but there's no clear evidence. In Missouri, in 1934, during his final months on the run, witnesses said he fired warning shots at a pursuing lawman, but not directly at civilians. And honestly, when you do the research on Pretty Boy, that sounds more to the truth right there. Still, the Bureau's reports credited Floyd with nearly 20 murders, most of which remain completely and utterly unproven. There is no solid evidence that links him directly to any cold-blooded executions. Everyone who knew Floyd, friends, family, even some lawmen, described the same paradox. He did carry a gun, but he rarely used it. He could be ruthless, but only when cornered. Birdwell, his longtime partner, once said, "Charlie wasn't mean. He just wouldn't be taken alive." That prophecy proves true, but not really. And we're going to discuss that here in a little bit. So, did Pretty Boy Floyd kill? Yes, in the sense that a man living by the gun inevitably does. No, in the sense that he was not the sadistic killer Hoover's Bureau made him out to be. Most historians now agree that Floyd's body count was inflated by FBI's propaganda machine, a convenient narrative that justified Hoover's war on crime. In reality, Floyd's violence was situational, not psychopathic, a poor man's defiance that spiraled into a national manhunt. They called him a murderer, but they made him a myth. Somewhere in that smoke, the truth got buried with the bodies. And here's where I think we should take 2 steps back and discuss the Kansas City Massacre fact versus the FBI fiction, like what we definitely know now years later. Within 24 hours of this incident, the Bureau announced the killers were Pretty Boy Floyd, Adam Riccati, and Vernon Miller. Newspapers ran the story nationwide. Hoover's young bureau, still fighting for federal arrest powers, suddenly had its perfect villains, photogenic outlaws whose guilt could not easily be disproved. But that speed alone, it raises red flags. No fingerprints or eyewitness IDs had even been confirmed. The ballistics was not finished. Floyd had no known connection to Frank Nash at all. How about that big, ginormous red flag? Where was Floyd, actually? His documented movements during that time with his partner, Adam Riccati, were traveling. They had been in Toledo days earlier and were likely heading home to Oklahoma. Near Wellsville, Ohio, their car broke down. Local mechanic later confirmed seeing them that same week, roughly 700 miles from Kansas City, when the massacre occurred. There are multiple witnesses that place them in Ohio and Pennsylvania during this time, not in Missouri. Even the FBI's own internal memos that have been declassified decades later admitted timeline inconsistencies. There's tons of eyewitness conflicts. Surviving agent Frank Smith described the main gunman as short, stocky, with sandy hair. Floyd was tall, he was dark-haired, and lean. Other witnesses recalled 3 or 4 gunmen, not 2. one wearing a police uniform, a detail never linked to Floyd's crew. And then those ballistics, they matched some bullets to a .45 Thompson submachine gun, but Floyd's usual weapon was a .351 Winchester rifle and sometimes a handgun. So, the really important point to make here, no weapon tied to Floyd was ever found or matched to that scene. So, who were the real shooters? Now that history's had time to look back on everything in the evidence, the likely planner was a man named Vernon C. Miller, who I mentioned briefly before. He was a former lawman who had turned enforcer, who owed favors to Frank Nash's old associates in the Midwest mob world. Modern historians believe the actual triggermen were Vernon Miller, Doc Barker, or another Barker Carpus gunman, possibly Cowboy Logan or Buster Shanahan, regional hitters tied to Kansas City's underworld. All three were dead within months, leaving no firsthand accounts. Then you also, of course, have Floyd's own denials. While hiding in Oklahoma later that summer, Floyd told multiple people that he had nothing to do with that. When he was captured and interrogated briefly before his death in 1934, he again insisted, "Never saw Frank Nash in my life." No evidence surfaced to contradict that directly. And I'm going to talk about this more. Yes, a lot of people don't know this. There was a very brief interrogation of him after he was shot in the field. That's when he did say, "I never saw Frank Nash in my life." And that was before he was killed. So, what historians now conclude, there's no solid proof that places Floyd anywhere near Union Station in Kansas City. Their timeline and the descriptions, they don't match. The Bureau needed convictions on paper. They were trying to justify new federal gun and kidnapping laws, so Floyd was politically convenient. Though he was certainly a wanted bank robber at the time, he had nothing to do with this. Now, the consequences of this lie, whether or not Floyd was there, Congress passed sweeping new powers for the Bureau within months. The birth of the modern FBI stemmed from this. And this is when you have Pretty Boy Floyd's name being connected as a cop killer, sealing his fate long before his death. Now, in my opinion, getting down to the worst of it. By the fall of 1934, public enemy era was coming to a close. Dillinger had been shot down outside the Biograph Theater in July. Babyface Nelson was being hunted across the Midwest. And J. Edgar Hoover still needed one last trophy, and that was Pretty Boy Floyd. For over a year, Floyd had evaded capture through Oklahoma's safe farms and sympathetic locals traveling with his friend and partner. The same partner wrongfully tied to also the Kansas City Massacre. Every major police department in the Midwest wanted the credit for catching him. In mid-October, Floyd and Riccati were driving east through Ohio 1930 Ford Coupe, heading towards Pennsylvania. Accounts suggest they were trying to lay low with friends or possibly leave the country altogether. On October 18th, near Wellsville, Ohio, their car skidded off the road and crashed into a telephone pole. Witnesses called police, unaware who the men were. When local officers arrived, Riccati panicked and opened fire, injuring a policeman before being captured. Floyd escaped on foot, vanishing into the nearby woods and farm country. For the next 2 days, he was a ghost, barefoot, hungry, and running through the cornfields of Ohio, sleeping in barns, eating apples off of trees, and asking for food at farmhouses. Locals said he was polite and quiet. He was exhausted, but he was never threatening, they said. One farmer later recalled him saying, "I just want to get back home to Oklahoma." On October 22nd, 1934, 4 days after the crash, a group of lawmen finally cornered him near East Liverpool, Ohio, the farm of Conkle and Ellen Heavens in a field known as the Cornfield Ridge. And then there was also several armed deputies and Ohio troopers. Here is where the story splits in two. We've got version 1. This was the official FBI account from back in the day. According to the Bureau's official reports, the agents spotted Floyd hiding behind a small rise near a wooded field. When ordered to surrender, he allegedly pulled a gun and was immediately shot by the FBI and local officers. They claimed he died on the spot from multiple bullet wounds, and Purvis standing over him as he took his last breath. Floyd's supposed last words were, "I'm done for. Tell them I'm glad it's over." That version became the official line, printed in every newspaper from New York to Los Angeles within 24 hours. Hoover had his victory. Now, let's discuss version 2, which historians all now agree is the true version, especially after the FBI declassified everything and we can see what really happened. The eyewitnesses, which were local men who were actually there, told a different and darker, much darker story. And honestly, I found it very disturbing when I was doing the research. Officer Chester C. Smith, one of the East Liverpool policemen present that day, spoke years later in an interview that blew apart the FBI's narrative. Smith said Floyd was already wounded and disarmed when they captured him. He'd been shot once in the arm when he tried to run through the field. The officers took him into custody alive, sat him up against a tree, and searched him. Then Melvin Purvis arrived with federal agents. According to Smith's statement, Purvis walked up and asked, "Is he still alive?" I said, and this is what Chester C. Smith is saying, so he's speaking right now. He goes, "I said, yes, he's still breathing." Purvis then says, "Well, you've done a good job, boys. We'll finish it from here." Then he nodded, and one of the agents pulled a Tommy gun and emptied it into Floyd's chest. Smith insisted that Floyd was executed, not shot in self-defense. Local coroner reports later point to 2 distinct sets of bullet wounds, and these bullet wounds were consistent with both rifle and submachine gun fire at close range. And if that doesn't turn your stomach, I don't know what does. I mean, it's disgusting. The reason? Dead men don't talk, and Hoover couldn't risk Floyd surviving to deny involvement in the Kansas City massacre, which had made the Bureau's reputation, all of this, just as unnerving and as nasty as what happened to Mal Barker. It's hard to feel bad for somebody like Babyface, who was clearly unhinged and extremely dangerous, or even Dillinger, who was a narcissist and had actually killed people. But there's so much about this era and everything that Hoover got away with and did, and all the propaganda. It's a real hard pill to swallow when you look back on it. The Bureau removed Floyd's body before local officials could complete a full investigation. His remains were displayed publicly in Sollysaw, Oklahoma. So again, the Bureau's putting dead bodies on display, just like all the rest, also completely sick. Ruby, his ex-wife, fainted at the casket. His mother, Mammy Floyd, reportedly whispered he was not what they said he was. The Bureau kept its story airtight for decades, despite contradictions in witness statements, coroner notes in the local press. Even Hoover's private files referred to Floyd's death as necessary to close the case. What happened in that Ohio field was more than just a killing. At that time was the end of the outlaw era. Dillinger, Nelson, Floyd, all dead within months, all shot rather than arrested, all men the FBI could have captured alive. Hoover's message to the nation was clear. The age of the outlaw is over. But beneath the message was another truth, that the Bureau's power was built on bodies and not on justice. He walked out of prison a boy who couldn't find a job. He died in a cornfield, executed for a crime no one proved he committed. The system called it justice. The people called it murder. And now that we are on episode 5 of this season, it may all be kind of running together, right? So let's go through the timeline at this point. May 23rd, 1934, you've got Bonnie and Clyde. They're ambushed and killed in Louisiana. Now, this was by Texas Rangers, not by the FBI. Dillinger shot outside the Biograph Theater. That was Melvin Purvis. And then there's October 22nd, and that's Pretty Boy Floyd. Again, this involves Melvin Purvis with the FBI, right? But then that's when you have November 27th, and it's Babyface Nelson killed after a shootout in Barrington, Illinois. Again, this is the FBI. I want to take just a quick moment to talk about Melvin Purvis's role in Hoover's revenge. Melvin Purvis was directly involved in 2 of the 4 major FBI kills, John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd. He was regionally in command when Babyface Nelson was killed, but he was not physically present. Those 2 kills made Purvis a national celebrity. Magazine covers, women were writing him fan mail. He even had movie offers. Hoover hated it. Within a year, Purvis was forced out of the FBI, quietly smeared as reckless and unfit. Hoover never forgave him for stealing the spotlight. In 1960, Purvis died from a gunshot wound. It was ruled a suicide, though there are rumors of other things. His funeral drew fellow agents who whispered he brought them down, but the Bureau brought him down too. And yes, I'm actually going to do a separate episode on him alone because his involvement in Hoover's, and of course the fact that supposedly he killed himself, makes you definitely want to take a second look at the history connected to that. Getting back to Pretty Boy Floyd, the people of Oklahoma did not celebrate, they wept. By dawn the next morning, thousands were already on the road, heading towards the tiny town of Atkins where his body was being brought home. On October 26, 1934, Charles Arthur Floyd's coffin arrived at the Atkins Baptist Church, carried in a plain wooden hearse draped with a white cloth. His mother, Mammy Floyd, sat at the front pew, clutching a Bible. His father, Walter, wept openly. An estimated 20,000 mourners crowded the fields around the church. Farmers, oil hands, widows, and Dust Bowl migrants stood shoulder to shoulder in the autumn sun, waiting hours to file past the open casket. Many brought flowers, others brought money, small bills, folded into envelopes, slipped into the casket as if to pay a debt of gratitude. They did not see a murderer. They saw a man who fought the banks that had taken their land, a man who had been hunted and killed by the same government they felt had abandoned them. The FBI didn't send agents to monitor the crowd. Hoover feared a riot, or worse, sympathy. He ordered all bureau men to let the story die quietly. But to his dismay, it did not. 4 years later, in 1939, folk singer Woody Guthrie, another Oklahoma native, wrote and performed what became one of the most endearing protest songs in American history, the ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd. If you gather round me, children, a story I will tell of Pretty Boy Floyd, an outlaw. Oklahoma knew him well. Guthrie's version of Floyd wasn't a killer or a bandit. He was a folk hero. Born of hunger and injustice, a man who stole from the banks that stole from the poor, who never forgot where he came from. The song ends with a line that still echoes like a verdict. Some will rob you with a 6-gun, and some with a fountain pen. It was Guthrie's way of saying the bankers and politicians who drove families from their farms were the real criminals. Floyd was just the one who fought back. The song spread through union halls, Dust Bowl camps, and radio stations, shaping how generations saw him. Woody Guthrie's disciple, Bob Dylan, one of my favorites, recorded his own version decades later. Pretty Boy Floyd had become less than a man and more a symbol of rebellion and justice, and the blurred line between outlaw and hero. Hoover, meanwhile, made sure the Bureau's official files painted a different story. In press briefings, Floyd was always described as a murderer, a psychopath, gunman. His body was paraded as proof war on crime had been a success. But the people who lived through the Depression, who lost homes, jobs, and dignity, did not buy it. In the towns he robbed, families told their children that Pretty Boy Floyd never hurt the poor. Even decades later, old timers said that he was rough, but he was fair, and he never robbed a man who couldn't afford it. There is always the making of an American myth. In the years that followed, movies, pulp, novels, and songs would rewrite the story again and again. You've got the Oklahoma Robin Hood, the Gentleman Bandit, the Last Real Outlaw. When the system broke, Floyd broke too. And in a way, he stood for millions who didn't have a gun, a getaway car, or a headline. Somewhere between the outlaw and the hymn, the truth still walks the hills of Oklahoma. You can bury a man, but not what he stood for. Nearly a century after he died in the Ohio cornfield, Pretty Boy Floyd still haunts America, not as a ghost in the hills, but as a mirror for all of us to look into. In every generation, there's a new version of him, a man or a woman who looks at the system built for the rich, stacked against the poor, and decides to push back. That's why Floyd's story refuses to die. He wasn't just an outlaw, he was the byproduct of a broken economy, a failed promise, a government that told millions of starving Americans to wait their turn. He lived in a world where banks could steal a man's farm and call it business, where the law called poverty a crime, where survival itself became rebellion. And when the newspapers called him public enemy number one, people saw something else, a poor kid from Oklahoma who dared to hit back. Hoover's FBI used Floyd's death to build an empire. The age of fingerprint files, national policy, and propaganda, the Bureau became a brand, and the man they shot down in a cornfield became the cautionary tale that justified it. But the deeper truth, the one that still makes this legend dangerous, is this. For millions of Americans, Pretty Boy Floyd was never the enemy. He was the only one who seemed to fight them. Today, the names have changed, but the script feels very familiar. Economic collapse, public anger, a system that protects the powerful and punishes the desperate. And every time that balance breaks, America rediscovers its love with the outlaw, the one who refuses to play by rules written against them. Maybe that's why Woody Guthrie's song still hits like scripture. Some will rob you with a six gun and some with a fountain pen. Because the fight Floyd represented, the one between survival and submission, never really ended. He died at 29 in a cornfield, but his story still rides the back roads of America. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If this story moved you, if it made you question the line between justice and survival, share it, like it, follow wherever you get your podcasts. Every share keeps this forgotten history alive, and every follow helps the project grow. Research and narration is done by me, can't you tell? Sources for this episode did include FBI case files on Charles Arthur Floyd, the Oklahoma Historical Society, Jeffrey King's The Life and Death of Pretty Boy Floyd, and Woody Guthrie's collected writings. Because in the end, the past is not dead. It was just doing time in the FBI files.